Graceland was never truly quiet. Even late at night, long after the gates closed and the lights dimmed, there was always movement, guards on rotation, distant engines on the road, the low hum of a life that never fully slept. But on one particular night, something unusual happened. A man appeared outside the gates. He didn't shout. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't try to get in. He just stood there. And he stayed all night. Stay until the end, because this is the story of the stranger no one noticed at first, and the moment Elvis realized that some people don't wait to be seen, they wait because they have nowhere else to go. The guard noticed him shortly after midnight. At first, he thought it was nothing, just another fan lingering longer than usual, hoping for a glimpse, a wave, some acknowledgement before giving up and heading home. It happened often enough to barely register. But this man didn't behave like the others. He didn't pace. He didn't call out. He didn't press against the gate. He stood still, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the house beyond the iron bars. Not staring aggressively, just present. Hours passed. The guard watched him through the routine of the night, shift changes, radio checks, the slow crawl of time that made every minute feel heavier than the last. Still, the man didn't move. When dawn was still hours away, curiosity replaced indifference. "You waiting for someone?" the guard asked finally, stepping closer to the gate. The man turned his head slowly, as if waking from a thought rather than reacting to a voice. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "I'm just here." That was all. No request. No explanation. The guard shrugged and stepped back. There were rules about engagement, and this didn't seem worth breaking them. As long as the man stayed outside the gate, he wasn't a problem. Inside Graceland, Elvis was awake. He often was at that hour, sleep coming in fragments, never fully settling. He sat near a window, lights low, the house quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence. Nights like this were when thoughts grew louder. That was when he noticed movement by the gate. Just a shape at first. Still. Too still. Elvis watched for a few moments, expecting the figure to drift away like so many others before. But it didn't. The figure stayed. Something about that unsettled him, not fear, but recognition. Elvis knew what it meant to stay somewhere not because you expected something to happen, but because leaving felt worse. He had done it himself, in different ways. Elvis leaned closer to the glass, focusing. The man wasn't young. He wasn't loud. He didn't look desperate or excited. He looked tired. Elvis turned away from the window, pacing the room slowly. He told himself it wasn't his concern. Fans came and went. Guards handled it. That was the boundary he had learned to keep for his own survival. Still, the image stayed with him. When Elvis looked again an hour later, the man was still there. The sky was beginning to lighten now, just barely. The world shifting toward morning. And yet, the stranger remained, unmoving, as if time had stopped for him alone. Elvis felt something tighten in his chest. He realized the man wasn't waiting for Elvis Presley the performer. He was waiting for someone. That distinction mattered. Elvis had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him: attention, validation, opportunity. This felt different. There was no urgency in the man's posture. No demand in his presence. Just endurance. Elvis stood there longer this time, watching as the guard approached the gate again, offering coffee, asking if the man needed anything. The stranger shook his head gently. "I'm fine," he said. And then, quietly, "I just didn't want to be alone tonight." That sentence reached Elvis even through the glass. It landed hard. Because it named something Elvis understood too well. Graceland, with all its space and security, had never protected him from loneliness. It had only given it room to echo. Elvis stepped back from the window, heart heavier than before. He realized that whatever brought that man to the gate wasn't curiosity. It was necessity. And for the first time that night, Elvis wondered if ignoring him would be easier or crueler. Elvis didn't sleep after that. He tried. He lay back in bed, stared at the ceiling, listened to the quiet of the house settling into morning, but his mind refused to loosen its grip. The stranger's words kept repeating, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of stubborn clarity. I just didn't want to be alone tonight. Elvis had heard thousands of sentences from fans over the years. Declarations of love, promises, tears, praise that felt so intense it almost became meaningless. But this wasn't devotion. It wasn't even admiration. It was loneliness spoken plainly, without performance. That was what unsettled him. Because Elvis recognized it. Not as an idea, but as a familiar ache. He knew what it felt like to be surrounded and still separate. To be visible and still unseen. To be needed and still alone. He stood up before sunrise, moved through the hallway quietly, avoiding the bright rooms as if light might change his mind. The house smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the scent of a place that carried history in every corner. He paused near the window again. The stranger was still there. The sky had shifted from black to deep blue. A pale gray line stretched at the horizon, the first suggestion that the world would soon start demanding things again. Yet the man remained exactly where he had been, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. Not waiting impatiently. Just staying. Elvis's first instinct was to dismiss it, to tell himself that stepping into it would be a mistake. Too risky. Too intimate. Too unpredictable. Graceland had gates for a reason. Fame had boundaries for survival. But something in Elvis resisted that reasoning. This didn't feel like someone trying to break in. It felt like someone trying not to break down. Elvis dressed simply, dark shirt, trousers, no jewelry, no stage energy. He moved like a man who didn't want to be recognized, even inside his own home. In the kitchen, he poured coffee but didn't drink it. He held the mug in both hands as if the warmth might steady the thought he couldn't push away. He heard movement in the house, a staff member, early and quiet, checking something. Elvis didn't call out. He didn't want this decision filtered through anyone else. If he did something, it needed to be his. Not advice. Not suggestion. Not management. He walked toward the foyer. The front door felt heavier than usual under his hand, as if the house itself was reminding him of what boundaries were meant to prevent. When Elvis stepped outside, the early air hit his face cold and clean. The driveway was silent. No cameras. No cars. Just the soft sound of wind through trees and distant road noise beyond the estate. He started walking toward the gate. Each step felt like crossing an internal line. Not because he was afraid of the stranger, but because he was afraid of what kindness might cost. Elvis had learned that empathy could be exploited. That good intentions could become headlines. That a small moment could be twisted into something larger than it was. But he kept walking anyway. When he reached the gate, the guard's eyes widened slightly, surprised but quick to recover. "Sir." Elvis raised a hand gently. "It's all right." The guard stepped back, unsure what to do. The stranger didn't move at first. He seemed not to notice Elvis' approach, as if he had convinced himself long ago that the gate would never open for him. Then Elvis spoke, not loudly, just enough. "You've been here all night." The man turned slowly. For a second, his face didn't register recognition. It registered exhaustion. Real tiredness, the kind that makes your features soften, makes your eyes look older than they are. Then his focus sharpened. He realized who was standing in front of him. His mouth opened slightly. He looked stunned, but not ecstatic. Not the way fans usually did. His surprise was quieter, almost embarrassed. He began, then stopped, as if words felt dangerous. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Elvis studied him closely, not as a star assessing a stranger, but as one human evaluating another's state. The man's hands were trembling subtly, whether from cold or something deeper Elvis couldn't tell. "Why are you here?" Elvis asked. The stranger swallowed. His eyes flicked downward, then back up. I didn't have anywhere else to go, he said. There was no dramatic story attached. No sudden tears. Just the simple statement of someone who had run out of places that felt safe. Elvis felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He had expected a request. A plea. An autograph. Something that fit the usual script. Instead, he was standing across from a person who seemed more surprised by being seen than by standing near Elvis Presley. That's a long way to come just to stand outside a gate, Elvis said, carefully. The stranger nodded once. I know. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken much lately. Elvis glanced briefly at the guard, then back to the stranger. The decision formed in him not as generosity, but as recognition, the understanding that some people didn't come to Graceland for magic. They came because it looked like the only place in the world where light still existed. Elvis didn't open the gate. Not yet. But he stepped closer. Close enough that the iron bars between them felt thinner than they should have. What's your name? Elvis asked. The stranger hesitated, then answered. And in that small exchange, just a name, just a question, Elvis realized something. This wasn't charity. This was the moment he stopped treating loneliness like a private shame. Because it was standing outside his gate, wearing another man's face. The man hesitated before speaking. Not because he was afraid of Elvis, but because he wasn't used to being asked questions that were meant to be answered. His name came out softly. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of name that disappears easily in a world that moves too fast. Elvis repeated it once, quietly, as if anchoring it in the air between them. They stood there for a moment, separated by iron bars and years of very different lives, yet bound by the same stillness. The guard shifted his weight but said nothing. Even he sensed this wasn't a situation to interrupt. You said you didn't have anywhere else to go, Elvis said carefully. That's a long night to stand outside. The man nodded, eyes dropping to the gravel beneath his shoes. He scuffed it once, then stopped, like he realized movement wasn't necessary. I wasn't looking for you, he said. Not really. Elvis didn't respond immediately. He let the sentence sit where it was, unfinished. I just knew this place would still be awake, the man continued. Even if no one was outside. That landed heavier than any dramatic confession could have. The man explained slowly, without urgency. He talked about a job that ended quietly. A marriage that didn't explode, it just emptied. Friends who meant well but didn't know what to do once things stopped being temporary. No villains. No tragedy packaged neatly. Just erosion. I didn't want to scare anyone, he said. Didn't want to sit in my car all night either. This place, it's lit. Even at night. Elvis felt something shift inside him. He had never thought about Graceland that way, as a place of light rather than legacy. To him, it was memory, obligation, echoes of who he had been and who people expected him to remain. To this man, it was simply somewhere that didn't go dark. I wasn't planning to come up to the gate, the man added quickly, as if apologizing. I just ended up closer than I thought. Elvis recognized that feeling too. He had ended up closer to his own limits more times than he could count, without meaning to. You ever feel like you disappear if no one's looking? The man asked suddenly, then froze, as if he'd said too much. Elvis didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. The answer surprised them both. For a moment, there was no Elvis Presley and no stranger. Just two men acknowledging something that didn't care about status. The man looked up, really looked at Elvis now, not as an icon, but as someone who had answered honestly. I thought, the man said slowly, that if I stood here long enough, maybe I wouldn't feel invisible. The words weren't dramatic. They were exhausted. Elvis leaned one hand against the gate, feeling the cold metal under his palm. He thought about all the times he had been surrounded by people who saw him constantly, and still felt unseen. Fame didn't cure invisibility. It just changed who believed they were entitled to your attention. Elvis understood then why this man hadn't shouted. Why he hadn't begged. why he had stayed. He wasn't demanding to be noticed. He was hoping presence alone might be enough to keep him anchored. The sky was lighter now. Morning was fully on its way. Elvis knew this moment couldn't stretch forever. He also knew that walking away would leave something unfinished, not just for the stranger, but for himself. "You cold?" Elvis asked. The man shrugged. "A little." That answer, simple as it was, decided everything. Elvis straightened and looked at the guard. "Get him some coffee," he said. Not as a request. As a statement. The guard nodded immediately. The man's eyes widened. "You don't have to." "I know," Elvis said gently. "But I want to." The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. Not obligation. Not expectation. Choice. As the guard moved away, Elvis remained at the gate, staying present, refusing to retreat into distance. He realized something then, something quiet but profound. Loneliness didn't always come to be fixed. Sometimes, it came just to be acknowledged. And standing there in the early morning light, Elvis felt the strange, grounding weight of being exactly where he was, not above, not removed. Just human. Elvis had spent his life learning where the lines were. Some were obvious: gates, guards, schedules, distance. Others were invisible, enforced by instinct and survival. Boundaries that kept him protected, but also separate. Necessary lines that had hardened into habits. This moment asked him to step over one. Not recklessly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The guard returned with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the cool morning air. Elvis took one and held it for a second, then passed it through the narrow opening in the gate. The man accepted it carefully, like something fragile. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Elvis nodded. He didn't say "you're welcome." Gratitude felt heavier than politeness right now. They stood there drinking in silence. The world beyond the property began to wake, distant traffic, birds testing the morning. Normal life reasserting itself. Elvis realized how rarely he witnessed this hour without performance attached to it. "You don't have to stay," the man said after a while, as if suddenly aware of the imbalance. "I didn't mean to." "I know," Elvis interrupted gently. "You're not asking." That was the truth of it. And that truth made all the difference. Elvis glanced toward the house, then back at the man. The decision pressed against him, not urgent, but insistent. He knew the risks. He knew how easily moments could be misunderstood, how kindness could become narrative. But he also knew something else. Avoiding humanity had become too easy. "Do you want to sit somewhere warmer?" Elvis asked. The man froze. Not from excitement, from uncertainty. "You mean, inside?" he asked. Elvis hesitated for just a second. "Yes." The gate didn't open immediately. Elvis spoke quietly to the guard, instructions clear but minimal. Protocol adjusted without fuss. The iron bars finally shifted, creating an opening that felt symbolic even as it remained practical. The man stepped through slowly, like someone afraid the ground might change under his feet. Inside the property, he stopped and looked around, overwhelmed not by luxury, but by safety. By the sense of being somewhere that didn't require explanation. Elvis led him not toward the grand rooms, but toward a smaller sitting area, modest, understated. A space that felt lived in, not displayed. They sat. No photographs. No autographs. No performance. Just presence. The man wrapped his hands around the warm mug, shoulders finally relaxing. He didn't cry. He didn't gush. He just exhaled. "I didn't expect this," he said. Elvis nodded. "Neither did I." And that was the truth. This wasn't charity. It wasn't a story to tell later. It was a choice made in the quiet, without witnesses who mattered. Elvis felt the weight of crossing that boundary, and also the lightness. He realized something important then: boundaries exist to protect, not to isolate. And sometimes, protecting yourself means choosing when to open the gate, not keeping it locked forever. They talked a little longer. Not about Elvis. Not about fame. About ordinary things. Weather. Work. The strange comfort of being awake while the world sleeps. When the time came for the man to leave, it wasn't abrupt. It wasn't awkward. It felt complete. At the gate, the man stopped and turned. "Thank you," he said again. "Not for letting me in. For not pretending I wasn't there." Elvis felt that settle deep. "You were always there," he replied. "I just finally noticed." The man walked away as the sun rose fully, blending back into a world that would never know where he'd been or what it had meant. Elvis watched until he disappeared from view. Then he turned back toward the house, carrying something unexpected with him. Not satisfaction. Perspective. After the stranger left, Graceland felt different. Not emptier, quieter in a way that didn't echo. Elvis walked slowly back into the house, the early sunlight spilling across the floors, touching framed photos, furniture, corners he had passed 1,000 times without really seeing. The house was waking up, but something inside him was finally settling. He sat alone in the living room, coffee growing cold in his hands, and thought about how strange the night had been, not because of what happened, but because of how simple it was. No cameras. No headlines. No applause. And yet, it lingered more than most performances ever had. Elvis realized then that fame had trained him to misunderstand loneliness. He had been taught that being surrounded meant being connected, that attention equaled presence. But the man at the gate had stripped that illusion away with quiet honesty. Loneliness wasn't about numbers. It was about recognition. Elvis thought about all the times he had felt invisible while being watched. About how often people spoke to him without speaking with him. The stranger hadn't wanted anything from him, not his voice, not his name, not his legacy. He had only wanted not to disappear for one night. That shook Elvis more than any demand ever could. He wondered how many people had stood at invisible gates of their own, hoping simply to be acknowledged. How many had been dismissed because they didn't know how to ask properly? And he wondered how often he himself had done the same. Fame, he realized, had made it easier to avoid vulnerability, not harder. Boundaries had turned into walls. Protection into distance. And distance into habit. Elvis leaned back and closed his eyes. The stranger hadn't come to Graceland because Elvis was powerful. He had come because the lights were on. That humbled him. For the first time in a long while, Elvis didn't feel the need to fill the morning with activity. He didn't reach for plans or distractions. He allowed the quiet to remain, not as absence, but as space. That night hadn't asked him to fix loneliness. It had asked him to see it. And once seen, it could never be unseen again. The world moved on quickly. Days passed. Schedules resumed. Graceland returned to its familiar rhythm. No one spoke about the stranger, and Elvis didn't bring it up. There was no reason to. Some moments weren't meant to be shared. They were meant to stay. But the night remained with him in subtle ways. Elvis noticed himself paying attention differently, to pauses in conversations, to people who lingered without speaking, to silences that weren't empty but waiting. He became less afraid of stillness. Less eager to fill it. The memory of the man standing outside the gate returned occasionally, not as an image, but as a feeling. A reminder that presence didn't require permission, only awareness. Elvis understood now that not every connection needed to be permanent to be meaningful. That some encounters existed solely to remind you of something you had forgotten about yourself. That night hadn't changed the course of his life dramatically. It had changed the way he stood in it. And sometimes, that was enough. On another quiet evening, weeks later, Elvis stood near the same window and looked out toward the gate. It was empty now. Quiet. Ordinary. He smiled faintly. Not because he expected the stranger to return, but because he knew that if someone else ever stood there, unseen, unasked, waiting not for fame but for acknowledgement, he would notice. The night a stranger waited outside Graceland all night wasn't about kindness. It was about recognition. And in recognizing someone else's loneliness, Elvis had finally softened his own.